And the first time anyone realized something was wrong with the valley was when the birds stopped making noise. Up until that moment, the patrol had been just another slow, miserable push through the Vietnamese jungle, humidity pressing like a hand on the back of the neck, boots sucking in and out of mud, leeches hiding in every puddle, and the distant buzz of insects weaving through the sound of men breathing and gear rattling. Then, all at once, the background chatter of the jungle faded, like someone had turned a dial and lowered the volume on the world. Private Harris at the rear of the column noticed it first. He opened his mouth to say something, but the man in front of him, Staff Sergeant Michael Rourke, was already raising his fist for a halt. The column froze, the line of helmets and rifles stiffening like a centipede turning to stone. Rourke listened. He had been in Vietnam long enough to know that the jungle had moods. It whispered and hummed when it was content, shrieked in downpours, crackled in dry heat, and fell utterly, unnaturally silent when something larger and more dangerous than birds moved through it. He scanned the tree line, eyes adjusting to the mottled pattern of light and shadow. They were too far from base for this place to be truly empty. This valley cut between two low ridges full of tall grass, scattered trees, and a narrow game trail they'd been following for the last half hour. It was a kind of terrain that looked almost open from above, but on the ground. Every clump of brush and dip in the earth offered cover to someone who knew what they were doing. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. "Something off, Sarge," Harris whispered behind him. "Shut it," Rourke said quietly, but without anger. He tilted his head, listening for the one sound he feared most out here. The faint metallic click of a safety, the shift of weight on a branch, the wrong kind of breath. For a long moment there was nothing, just the slow drip of moisture from leaves, the faint rustle of the men behind him, adjusting their grips on their rifles. Then he saw it. Not a man, not movement. Just the tiniest flicker of shadow where no wind was blowing. High in the branches of a tree on the left ridge, a shape adjusted its position by an inch and froze again. Sniper, he thought. At least one. His stomach tightened. A sniper meant planning. Planning meant more than one man. He leaned back, voice barely audible. Down. Now. The word had barely left his mouth when the valley exploded. The first bursts came from the right. 3 or 4 AK-47s firing almost in unison. The flat, harsh crack of their shots slicing through the air. Then more from the left, then higher up. Within seconds, the quiet valley turned into a crossfire. Bullets slashing into the tall grass and tearing bark off trees, the sound so loud and so sudden that half the patrol flinched instead of dropping. Rourke didn't flinch. He grabbed Harris by the vest and yanked him down as he threw himself forward, hitting the dirt hard enough to knock the breath from his lungs. Rounds chewed the air where his chest had been an instant before. "Cover, find cover," someone screamed, but it was already too late for at least 2 men. Rourke saw them go down in his peripheral vision, one spinning as rounds slammed into his side, the other crumpling like a puppet with strings cut. Muzzle flashes strobed along both ridges now, not random but staggered, disciplined. Someone had done their homework. He heard the heavier, deeper thump of an RPD light machine gun open up from the right flank, its rounds ripping long horizontal lines through the grass and dirt. Pinned, Rourke thought. We are well and truly pinned. Okay. He dug his elbows into the damp soil and crawled to a shallow depression next to a broken tree stump, feeling the rounds smack into the ground behind him. Dirt sprayed across his face. Harris slid in beside him, eyes the size of $50. "Where are they?" Herrick gasped. "Everywhere we don't want them to be," Rourke said. He risked a quick look over the stump, just enough to count. The ridges weren't fully visible through the vegetation, but he saw enough rifle barrels emerging from behind rocks. Shadows of men moving between trees, occasional glints of metal where the sun hit an exposed weapon. He counted silently, moving his eyes from left to right, splitting the hillside into sectors like he'd been taught years ago. 1 firing position, 2, 3, another cluster near a boulder, 1 machine gun on the right, maybe another farther back. Movement between them, more than a squad, more than a platoon. 40 at least, probably more. By the time he finished, his mind had settled on a number that made his skin crawl. 48. That's what it felt like. 48 rifles in one very bad day. Harris started to lift his weapon, but Rourke shoved the barrel back down. "Don't skyline yourself," he barked. "You pop up for more than a second, they'll cut your head off." "Then what do we do?" Harris asked, voice breaking. "We can't stay here." He was right. They couldn't. Behind them, further down the column, the lieutenant was shouting into the radio, trying to raise someone, anyone, over the crackle and roar. Rourke knew what the answer would be even if they got through. Artillery was risky this close. Air support would take time. Time was the one thing they did not have. He pressed his cheek against the stock of his rifle and sighted toward the right ridge. not to fire, but to get a better look. The machine gun team was dug in behind a fallen log, slightly elevated, with a clear line on most of the valley floor. 2 men, gunner and assistant. They were pivoting back and forth, stitching the ground whenever they saw the slightest twitch of movement. He shifted his focus higher. That sniper was still out there. The initial shot that hadn't come yet was almost worse than if it had. Somewhere in the branches, behind leaves and bark, someone with a scope and patience was waiting for a clear target. Rourke scanned until his eye caught another anomaly, a patch of darker shadow in the crook of 2 branches. A shape that didn't quite match the tree. For a fraction of a second, he thought he saw the faint gleam of glass. He exhaled slowly, feeling his heartbeat quiet just a little. Fear was still there. It would remain. But underneath it, a different gear clicked into place. The one that turned when there was nothing left between you and the math of survival. "Listen to me," he said to Harris. "We are not going to beat them trading rounds from the middle of this valley. We stay here. We die here. Simple as that." Harris swallowed. "What then?" Rourke looked upslope to the left, not at the bullets, but at the line of dense brush higher up, where the ridge steepened and the foliage thickened into a darker band. The enemy fire was focused downward on the obvious killing ground. They weren't watching their highest flank yet. Why would they? No one in their right mind would choose to go up, into a steeper slope under fire, when down looked like the only way out. That was exactly why it might work. "Up," he said. Harris blinked. "Up? They've got us bracketed down here," Rourke said. "They're looking low. They think we're already in the trap. That high line up there," he nodded toward the band of brush, "is the one place they're not watching. You get to that, you get behind their eyes. You understand? You want to climb into more fire?" "I want to get somewhere they're not aiming," Rourke snapped. "Count how many rounds are hitting up there, then count how many are hitting down here." Harris flinched as another burst chewed up the grass 5 feet away. "Okay," he said. "Okay, so how do we get there?" "We crawl," Rourke said. "Little bursts. Head down, 3 seconds, no more. You move when I move. You don't stop until you feel brush against your face." "Got it?" Harris nodded, though his eyes still screamed that this was insane. "Good," Rourke said. "On my mark. One more thing." "What?" "If I stop moving, you keep going," Rourke said, locking eyes with him. "Don't you dare die just because I did. You get up there. You make it matter." Harris opened his mouth to argue, then shut it. He nodded once, jaw clenched tight. Rourke took one more breath, tasting dirt and fear and the metallic edge of decision. "Now," he hissed. He exploded forward, hugging the earth so tightly he could feel rocks and roots scraping his chest. Bullets tore through the air overhead, but most of them were still angled down toward where the patrol had been moments ago. The ground felt steeper than it had looked, each foot of elevation a battle of muscle and will. He drove his elbows in, pulling himself higher, boots pushing off mud. He reached a small dip behind a root and rolled into it, head still tucked low. Harris slid in next to him, his breath coming in sharp gasps. Again, Rourke said. They moved in jagged intervals, 3 seconds at a time, then 5 when they had to cross a patch with no cover. Then 2 when the incoming fire shifted just a fraction too close. Dirt kicked into their faces, leaves shredded above them, bark splintered. Once, a round grazed Rourke's shoulder, a punch of heat and impact that almost spun him, but he forced his limbs to respond, dragging himself onward. By the time he felt branches slapping against his helmet and face, his arms were shaking and his lungs burned. He pushed deeper into the brush until the world around him turned dimmer, sound muffled by leaves and trunks. He collapsed behind a thick tree, chest heaving, sweat pouring down his face in rivers. Harris lay beside him, staring up at the canopy with wild, grateful eyes. We're alive, he panted. For the moment, Rourke said. He forced himself to sit up, ignoring the angry throb in his shoulder. He squinted through a gap in the foliage, down and across. From this angle, the valley looked different. The enemy positions that had been vague flashes of light and shadow now resolved into clearer shapes. He could see lines of men tucked behind rocks, the curve of the fallen log that shielded the machine gun, the routes runners used to move ammunition and messages. They had built a beautiful kill zone. He could admire the design even as he resented being inside it. He also saw something else. None of the enemy rifles were pointed upslope. None of the men were watching their backs. 48 rifles, he murmured, and not one of them thinks death lives behind them. Harris frowned. What? Rourke adjusted the sling on his rifle, wiped sweat from his eyes with the back of his hand, and settled the weapon into his shoulder. Now, he said quietly, almost to himself, we find out how much damage one man can do when no one understands he's still in the fight. He rested his cheek against the stock, breathed in, and began to hunt. Rourke let his breathing slow until it matched the rhythm of the jungle again. The trick wasn't to become fearless. It was to become quiet enough inside your own head to hear what the fight was telling you. Down in the valley, the ambush still had momentum. The machine gun on the right flank was the spine of it, controlling movement, forcing men flat. The riflemen on the ridges were the ribs, tightening whenever someone tried to shift. And somewhere up in the trees, a patient shooter was waiting for a clean target, the kind of shot that turned panic into collapse. If Rourke could break the spine, the ribs loosened. If the ribs loosened, his people could move. He pushed the rifle forward through a slit in leaves and sighted on the machine gun position behind the fallen log. The gunner's shoulder rose and fell in steady cadence as he fired short bursts, paused, then fired again, disciplined and experienced. Rourke waited until the assistant leaned out to feed a fresh belt. He didn't rush the shot. He didn't chase the moment. He let the moment come to him. One squeeze, controlled and smooth. The assistant jerked and disappeared behind the log. The gunner hesitated, the weapon stuttering for half a beat. Then the gunner shifted his weight as if to see what had happened. Rourke fired again, not with triumph, but with necessity. The machine gun went silent. The first real change in the valley was immediate. The enemy fire didn't stop, but its shape changed, losing that heavy, flattening pressure that had made movement impossible. Rourke shifted his aim higher, scanning for leadersmen who stood too tall, moved too freely, pointed and shouted. He saw one near a rock outcropping on the right ridge, gesturing sharply as if redirecting fire. Rourke held the sight picture steady and fired. The man dropped out of view. A second figure leaned over the rock, trying to see where the shot came from, then snapped back as if suddenly remembering the rules of survival. Harris beside him made a sound like he was swallowing a curse. Rourke didn't look away from the gap in the foliage. "Keep your head down," he muttered. "Watch for movement. If they start looking up, tell me before they start shooting." Harris nodded, eyes darting across the ridgeline as if the whole jungle had teeth. Down below, Rourke caught flashes of his own patrol shifting. Not retreating yet, but adjusting, pulling wounded behind what cover they could find, trying to build some kind of coherent line. He couldn't hear the lieutenant over the gunfire, but he could see the gesturesmen trying to regroup. One radio handset lifted and shaken like it might suddenly behave if threatened hard enough. The ambush had been designed to crush them fast, to keep them pinned until the enemy could close in and finish it. Taking out the machine gun had bought them air, not safety, not victory. Air. Rourke moved his rifle to the left ridge, searching for the sniper he'd sensed earlier. Snipers didn't fire constantly. They waited for the right target, the leader who stood to wave men forward, the medic who exposed himself to reach a wounded soldier, the radio operator who popped up to get a signal. Rourke didn't want to wait for that shot to happen. He studied the tree line with the obsessive patience of someone looking for a needle while bullets were falling like rain. Quote. Then he saw what he'd seen before, a slight mismatch in shadow, a shape too rigid to be wind and leaves. He didn't have a perfect view, but he didn't need perfect. He needed plausible. He fired once into the crook of branches. The shape dropped out of sight like a puppet released from a string. The left ridge's fire faltered for a second. The way it did when men realized something they couldn't see was killing them from a direction that made no sense. Harris sucked in a breath. "How are you doing that?" he whispered. Rourke kept his cheek against the stock. "Because they planned for fear," he said, "not for stubbornness. The enemy started to adapt. It was subtle at first, one or two rifles angling higher, probing the brush line where Rourke hid. Leaves snapped and twitched above him as rounds cut through. Dirt puffed from the tree trunk near his head. Harris flinched, but Rourke's voice stayed level. "They've realized the high flank exists," he said. "That means we don't stay in one spot." He crawled sideways through the thick brush, moving like a careful animal, keeping low enough that his helmet never broke the line of leaves. Harris followed, dragging himself and the extra magazines, breathing hard through clenched teeth. Rourke found another shallow pocket behind two roots and settled in, reacquiring the ridge. He fired again, dropping a man who was running ammunition forward. Another shot, another figure collapsing behind a rock. The enemy responded with a ragged volley into the brush, but it was unfocused, angry, and blind. Anger was not aim. Rourke didn't waste rounds on guesses. He waited for shapes. He fired only when the shot was real. Each time he fired, he moved again, never letting the enemy solve him like a problem they could repeat. Down in the valley, he saw the Americans finally start to peel back in small bounds, dragging wounded, covering each other, no longer frozen. In that small change, men moving instead of dying in place, Rourke felt the first hard thread of hope. Harris tapped his shoulder and pointed. On the right ridge, 3 enemy fighters were breaking off from their positions and angling toward the high brush line, moving in a staggered formation that made Rourke's stomach tighten. They weren't retreating, they were hunting. They decided the mystery behind them was more dangerous than the men pinned below. "They're coming up," Harris whispered, panic flaring. Rourke watched the spacing, the way one paused while the other moved, the way they used trees and rocks, the way they never stood in the open longer than a second. These weren't amateurs. If they got close enough, the advantage of elevation disappeared. It would become a short-range fight in thick brush, the kind of fight decided by seconds and luck. "We're not letting them get eyes on us," Rourke said. He shifted his position by a few feet, found a narrow lane through the foliage, and waited. When the lead fighter stepped into the lane, Rourke fired once, and the man dropped. The other two froze instantly, flattening behind cover. Rourke didn't shoot blindly into where they disappeared. He waited for the moment one of them had to move, because in the jungle everyone eventually had to move. 20 seconds felt like 2 minutes. Then a shoulder appeared behind a tree as one tried to reposition. Rourke fired. The third man turned and ran downslope, scrambling back toward the ridgeline as if he'd suddenly decided the valley was safer than the brush. For a brief moment, the enemy's firing line lost its will. Artillery was still minutes away. Air support might never arrive in time, but morale could break before steel arrived, and Rourke could hear it in the uneven pattern of shots and shouted commands. On the ridge, fighters began pulling back from exposed positions, moving deeper into cover, trying to reset their angles. That was the opening. Rourke leaned close to Harris until their helmets nearly touched. "We need to signal the lieutenant," he said. "They're collapsing. He has to move now while they're confused." Harris stared at him. "How?" Rourke pointed downslope to a small patch of open ground where the trunk of a fallen tree lay like a bridge. "You crawl down 10 yards, just enough to line of sight. You wave your helmet, don't stand, don't shout. Just show 'em we've got their flank." Harris looked like he wanted to argue that this was a good way to get killed. Then he nodded once, swallowed hard, and slid away into the brush. Rourke kept firing in controlled intervals as Harris moved, not to rack up kills, but to keep the enemy's attention split and uncertain. When Harris returned, face pale but alive, Rourke saw movement in the valley change again. Small groups of Americans began to bound out of the deepest kill zone, one team covering while the other moved, the beginning of an organized withdrawal instead of a massacre. The enemy reacted the way a trap reacts when its prey slips the teeth. They surged fire back into the valley, trying to repin the Americans before they could escape. Rourke answered by cutting down the one thing that made their surges effective, the men who coordinated them. He waited for the ones who shouted and pointed, the ones who moved like they trusted their own plan. He fired, then he moved, fired again, moved again. His shoulder throbbed, his mouth was dry, and sweat ran into his eyes, but he kept the rifle steady through sheer refusal. Down below he saw the lieutenant alive, limping, helping a wounded man crawl. That sight hit Rourke harder than any bullet. It meant there were still people to save. It meant his decisions were not just delaying the inevitable, they were changing it. The enemy, realizing the Americans were slipping away, began to shift fighters along the ridge, trying to cut them off farther back. Rourke saw it forming and felt a cold urgency. If the enemy got around them, the escape route would close. He needed to do something bigger than picking off individuals. He needed to buy time on the scale of minutes, not seconds. He crawled to a higher point in the brush, found a narrow view of the ridge's spine, and keyed his own radio, the one he'd kept mostly silent to avoid giving away position. The net was still messy, but now there were clearer voices, and that meant support was closer than it had been. "Falcon, this is ground element," he said into the handset, voice tight but controlled. "Enemy line is degrading. They're shifting forces along the ridgeline to cut off withdrawal. If you can put steel on that ridge spine, you'll break them." A pause filled with static. Then, "Say again your position." Rourke gave the best grid reference he could, then added the simplest truth. "We are on the high flank. 2 men. We are behind enemy line of fire. Be advised, friendly elements are withdrawing in the valley." There was another pause, longer this time. "Copied," the voice said finally. "Stand by. Artillery's available. Danger close will be required." Rourke's jaw clenched. Danger close meant calculation and trust. It meant putting explosions near friendlies because the alternative was worse. "Approved," he said. "We're already in danger close." When the first incoming rounds whistled overhead, Rourke flattened himself into the earth, grabbing Harris and pulling him down by the shoulder strap. The impacts walked along the ridge spine in a tight line, thumping the ground with concussive force and throwing up trees and dirt in violent bursts. The enemy's shifting movement stopped, not because they chose to, but because the ridge was suddenly a place where no one could stand and remain intact. Fire from the ridges collapsed into scattered bursts, then into silence, broken only by frantic, isolated shots. In the valley, the Americans began moving faster now that the pressure above them had been punched out. Rourke lifted his head just enough to see the effect. Smoke and shredded leaves drifted across the ridgeline. Dark shapes fled deeper into the jungle. The ambush, so perfect, so disciplined, was unraveling into survival, the same way every plan eventually did under enough stress. Harris stared at him, eyes glassy. "How are we alive?" he asked. Not like a question, but like a confession. Rourke looked downslope, watching his men break free of the valley in staggered groups, carrying wounded, helping each other, moving because they had been given the chance. He swallowed, feeling the tremor in his hands now that the worst of the pressure had lifted. "We're alive because we moved," he said, and because they didn't believe anyone would. He shifted his rifle and began crawling again, because he knew the enemy was not gone, only scattered, and the jungle still had a way of collecting men who thought the fight was over. Rourke kept low as the last artillery impacts faded into rolling echoes. Smoke drifted through gaps in the canopy like gray cloth being pulled across the ridge. For a few seconds, the jungle was quiet again quiet in the wrong way, because silence after violence didn't mean peace. It meant everyone left alive was listening, recalculating, deciding whether to run, hide, or strike back. Harris crawled up beside him, face streaked with sweat and dirt, eyes locked on the ridgeline where enemy fire had been strongest. "Is it over?" he whispered. Rourke didn't answer right away. He pressed his cheek into the mud and watched the valley through the leaves, searching for the thing that would kill them now. A single surviving fighter who stayed calm enough to aim. A small team that circled wide. A delayed counter-ambush waiting for the first American to stand up and celebrate. He saw movement downslope, his platoon, battered but still moving, still organized. Men carried others. One soldier dragged a buddy by the straps of his vest, teeth clenched so hard his jaw looked locked. The lieutenant was there, limping, signaling with his arm, trying to keep the withdrawal controlled instead of turning into a stampede. "It's not over," Rourke said finally. "But it's broken." The difference mattered. A broken enemy was still dangerous, but no longer predictable. Predictable was what killed platoons. Broken was what you could survive if you didn't make a mistake. He shifted his rifle and scanned the ridgeline again. Shapes moved deeper into brush. A few silhouettes crossed a narrow opening and vanished. None of them fired. That told him more than any report could. They were leaving or they were repositioning. "Morales," he murmured into the radio, using the call sign of one of the squad leaders he'd last heard. "This is Rourke. Enemy fire is down. You need to move your people out now. Don't stop in the valley. Get to the tree line north. Over." Static, then a strained voice. "Rourke? Where the hell are you?" "Up high," Rourke said. "On their back. Just move." A pause. "Copy. We're moving. We've got wounded." "Everyone does," Rourke replied. "Don't let that freeze you." He clicked off and looked at Harris. The kid's hands were trembling so hard his rifle barrel shook. He wasn't cowardly. He was overloaded. There was a difference, and Rourke had learned to see it. He reached out and gripped Harris's forearm hard enough to anchor him. "Look at me," Rourke said. Harris forced his eyes up. "You're doing fine," Rourke told him. "The shaking is your body trying to empty the fear. Let it. But you keep moving, you keep breathing, you keep listening. That's all." Harris swallowed and nodded, and the shaking didn't stop, but it slowed. Sometimes all a man needed was permission not to be made of steel. They began crawling laterally along the high brush line, parallel to the valley's escape route. Rourke didn't want to descend yet. Down there, they'd be back inside the geometry of the enemy's original plan. Up here, they were still an unknown factor. If any enemy fighters tried to re-establish fire on the withdrawing Americans, Rourke wanted to be in position to punish it immediately. As they moved, Rourke's mind kept doing the same cold arithmetic it had been doing since the first crack of gunfire. How far were his men from the tree line? How long until the enemy recovered enough to try again? How many rounds did he have left? He checked his magazine by feel, not by looking. His shoulder throbbed, and every time he shifted his weight, the graze on his upper arm burned, but pain was information. It meant he could still respond. He could still aim. Harris suddenly froze and pointed. Through the brush, Rourke saw 3 figures moving downslope, low and careful. Not Americans. Their pace was wrong, too fluid in the terrain, and their weapons were held like extensions of their bodies. They weren't fleeing from the artillery. They were circling to find the Americans as they withdrew, trying to salvage kills from a failed ambush. Rourke's stomach tightened. This right here was how men died after the big noises ended. He eased his rifle forward. The lead fighter paused behind a tree, scanning the valley. Rourke waited for him to lean, to expose something real. A shoulder, a cheek, a hint of profile. When it came, he fired once. The man collapsed behind the trunk without a sound. The other two stiffened and melted into cover instantly. Harris's breath hitched. They're close. Yeah, Rourke said. That means we can't miss. He didn't shoot again immediately. Blind shooting was what the enemy wanted, because it gave them direction. He listened. He watched leaves tremble. He waited for the tiny betrayals, movement that didn't match the wind, a flash of metal, a shape that blocked light. After nearly a minute, one of the remaining fighters tried to reposition, creeping toward higher ground. Rourke saw his outline for half a second and fired. The man dropped, weapon clattering softly against roots. The third fighter didn't run. He stayed still, which meant he was either smart or terrified, and both were dangerous. Rourke shifted left, inch by inch, changing his angle. Finally, he spotted a face-size wide, jaw clenched, trying to stay hidden behind leaves that weren't thick enough. Rourke held the sight picture steady and fired. The face vanished. Harris stared at him like Rourke had just performed something supernatural. It's not magic, Rourke said, reading his expression without looking. It's angles and patience. He kept moving with Harris along the high line, and in the valley below, the Americans were finally clearing the worst ground. Rourke saw them reach the tree line north and begin pulling in, forming a loose perimeter, dragging the last wounded into cover. A medic knelt over someone, hands working fast. The lieutenant moved between men, counting, checking faces, touching shoulders like he needed to confirm they were real. Rourke felt something loosen in his chest that he hadn't realized was locked. Not relief exactly. More like permission to feel the weight of what almost happened. If you've ever wondered what outnumbered really means, it's not a statistic. It's the sensation of being inside a mouth with teeth all around you, and realizing the only reason it hasn't closed yet is because someone is holding it open with their hands. Rourke didn't have time to think about that earlier. Now for a second it hit him. Harris whispered, "Sarge, how many do you think there were?" Rourke didn't answer with a number. "Enough," he said. "More than we should have walked into." They held the high brush for several more minutes, watching for any renewed movement. Then the sound of helicopters began to grow in the distance, first a faint thudding, then a stronger, unmistakable chop that turned air into vibration. Medevac birds coming in, low and cautious, and possibly gunships with them. Rourke keyed the radio. "Falcon, this is ground element on high flank. Friendly forces are regrouped at the north tree line. Enemy survivors are scattered, some still moving in small teams. Be advised, potential contact still possible." "Copy," the voice replied. "Gunships are inbound. Keep heads down. We're sweeping." Rourke looked at Harris. "We go down now," he said. "But we don't stroll. We descend like someone is still aiming at us, because someone probably is." They began sliding and crawling down the slope, using roots like handholds, keeping their silhouettes broken by brush. Halfway down, Harris's boot slipped and he nearly tumbled, but Rourke caught his vest and yanked him back into control. Harris's eyes were glassy with exhaustion now. Adrenaline was bleeding out of him, leaving behind the hollow fatigue that made legs feel like they belonged to someone else. When they finally emerged near the regroup point, rifles immediately swung toward them. Two shadowy figures stepping out of the brush were exactly what everyone feared. Then someone recognized Rourke's helmet and shouted his name. The rifles lowered and men rushed toward them with the stunned, hungry energy of survivors who needed to see the one thing that made their escape make sense. The lieutenant, First Lieutenant Caldwell, limped forward, blood dried along one cheek and sleeve torn open. He stared at Rourke like he was looking at someone who had died and returned. "Rourke," Caldwell said, voice hoarse. "I lost you in the first minute. I thought you were gone." "Not gone," Rourke said. His throat felt tight and he didn't like that. He kept his voice steady. "We got high, we hit their flank." Caldwell blinked. "You and—" He looked at Harris. "Him?" Rourke nodded. Caldwell's gaze flicked past them, up toward the ridge. His expression shifted from disbelief to something else. Understanding, maybe, or the beginning of it. "You took out that machine gun," Caldwell said. More statement than question. Rourke didn't claim it. "It stopped," he replied. "That's what mattered." Around them, men sagged against trees, some sitting in the mud like puppets with cut strings. Wounded were laid out in a rough line under ponchos and ripped sleeves, waiting for the medevac. The medic's hands were red with someone else's pain. A few soldiers stared into space, blinking slowly, not yet back in their own bodies. Harris sank to his knees, shaking again, and this time no one blamed him. A corporal handed him a canteen. Harris drank like he'd never tasted water before. Caldwell stepped closer to Rourke, lowering his voice. "How many, Staff Sergeant?" Rourke looked at him. He could have said he didn't know. He could have avoided the number, but he'd seen the positions. He'd felt the volume of fire. He'd watched men moving along both ridges like a net tightening. 48, Rourke said quietly. Give or take. Enough to erase us if we stayed in the valley. Caldwell exhaled, slow and shaky. Jesus. Rourke turned his head slightly toward the wounded line. How many did we lose? Caldwell's face tightened. Not as many as we would have, he said. We lost men. But we still have a platoon. Barely. If you hadn't, he stopped, as if the sentence couldn't be finished in a way that felt real. Rourke didn't let him praise him. Praise made it personal, and personal made it heavy. Get them out, he said, nodding toward the wounded. That's the win. The helicopters arrived moments later, chopping the air apart, flattening grass and leaves. The jungle turned into wind and noise and swirling dust. Medics moved fast, loading stretchers, shouting over rotors. A gunship circled above, scanning the tree line, ready to tear apart any enemy fighter dumb enough to show himself now. As the last stretcher lifted off, Caldwell approached Rourke again. I need you to tell this story later, he said, to debrief, to command. Whatever. They'll want to know how we got out. Rourke glanced at the ridge one more time, smoke still lingering like a bruise in the air. Tell them we didn't accept the valley, he said. Tell them we climbed. The hours after a firefight were always stranger than the fight itself. In the valley, time had been measured in bursts of rifle fire in the space between breaths. Now it was measured in rotor wash, blood pressure cuffs, shouted names, and the dull, stunned silence of men who were still alive but hadn't fully accepted it yet. As the last helicopter lifted away, the jungle swallowed the sound almost immediately, leaving only the wet heat and the smell of churned earth. Caldwell ordered a tighter perimeter for another 30 minutes, not because he expected a full counterattack, but because Vietnam had a way of punishing anybody who acted like the story was finished when the last shot faded. Rourke stood near the tree line with his rifle slung and his shoulder wrapped in a quick field dressing, watching the ridge line through gaps in foliage. He didn't feel heroic. He felt wrung out, like the jungle had taken a piece of him and hadn't decided whether to give it back. Harris sat with his back against a tree, knees pulled up, canteen in his hands. Every few seconds he looked at Rourke as if checking whether he was still there. When the platoon finally moved slow, careful, keeping intervals, Rourke stayed near the rear, where he could see everyone and where the job was less about shooting and more about refusing to let fear reorganize into panic. They reached a temporary pickup point near dusk. The light turned gold and then bled into dim green shadow under the canopy. A truck convoy met them at a rough track, and the men climbed aboard without much talking. Some stared outward, some stared at their boots. A few kept glancing back the way people look at a house after a fire, trying to understand how quickly something familiar can become dangerous. Back at base, the medics took the wounded and the living fell into a kind of mechanical routine. Rifles were checked, magazines refilled, canteens topped off, boots unlaced and retied. Caldwell went straight to the operations tent to report, and within minutes the word began to spread through the company area. An ambush, a kill zone, 2 ridge lines, a machine gun. Men pinned so hard they couldn't lift their heads. Then the sudden change, enemy fire collapsing, bodies able to move, wounded being dragged out instead of left behind. Stories moved faster than official reports. By the time Rourke was sitting on an ammo crate outside the hoche, cleaning mud off his weapon with a rag, someone had already said it out loud like it was a legend. Rourke held off nearly 50 Viet Cong by himself. Rourke heard the sentence and felt a hard, quiet irritation in his chest. Not because it sounded too big, because it sounded too simple. Myths were neat. The valley hadn't been neat. The valley had been chaos, fear, angles, and seconds. The valley had been men doing exactly what they could with what they had left. Caldwell found him later, after the first wave of debriefing and the initial casualty lists. The lieutenant looked older than he had that morning. Out in the jungle, rank mattered, but survival had its own hierarchy, and it left marks faster than time did. Caldwell sat on a crate across from Rourke and held out a can. Coffee, lukewarm, bitter, better than nothing. Rourke took it without speaking. For a while they just listened to the bass sounds, distant radios, generators, a helicopter landing somewhere beyond the trees. They're going to write it up, Caldwell said finally, after action. Hire wants a clean explanation for why a platoon walked into an ambush like that. Rourke stared at the coffee. There isn't a clean explanation. No, Caldwell admitted. But there will be a report anyway, so I need your part straight. Not the story people are telling. The truth is as close as we can get it. Rourke exhaled slowly. The closest truth is that we got lucky after we got smart. We climbed because staying low was death. We found their machine gun because it was the loudest thing in the valley. And we hit it because they weren't looking up. That's it. Caldwell nodded, then hesitated as if the next question tasted wrong. How many do you think it was? Rourke's jaw tightened. You already asked. I need it on paper, Caldwell said. Command will demand a number. Rourke looked up at him, eyes steady. Put unknown, put multiple squads, put estimates unreliable. Out there you don't count bodies like a clerk. You count firing points. You count angles. You count how the fire feels. I said 48 because that's what the valley felt like. 48 rifles doesn't mean 48 men were staring at me. It means the ambush was built with enough shooters to erase us. Caldwell held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded once, slowly. That's fair. Rourke turned the can in his hands. Don't let them turn it into something it wasn't. What was it then? Caldwell asked quietly. Rourke's eyes drifted not to the ridgeline now, but inward, to the memory of men dropping at the first bursts, to the medic's hands moving too fast, to Harris's face when the machine gun went silent and the pressure lifted for the first time. It was a platoon that refused to die in place, he said. And one kid who crawled higher with me when his whole body was screaming not to. Caldwell glanced toward the hoach where Harris was inside with the other survivors. He's a mess. He'll be a mess for a while, Rourke said. So will I. That was the part no one put in the stories. Not the shots, not the movement, the way your hand shook when you tried to light a cigarette, the way you snapped at a friend for talking too loud, the way your mind replayed a single-second one burst, one scream, one decision, over and over like it was trying to find an alternate ending. Weeks later, Caldwell told him there would be a recommendation for recognition. Rourke didn't argue. He also didn't celebrate. Medals didn't erase the faces of the men who didn't make it back to the tree line. Recognition felt like a spotlight on a moment that belonged to everyone who had crawled, dragged, lifted, covered, and refused to quit. When Harris finally spoke about that day without his voice cracking, it wasn't to praise Rourke. It was to say one simple thing, over and over, like an anchor. If he hadn't gone up, we'd have died down there. That sentence traveled farther than any report. Years later, when the war was behind them in calendars but not in memory, Rourke would still think of the valley on nights when the world was too quiet. He'd remember the moment the birds stopped, the way the jungle seemed to hold its breath before it tried to swallow them whole. He'd remember the machine gun's rhythm and the sudden, impossible relief when it broke. He'd remember Harris's shaking hands and the look in his eyes when he realized fear didn't disqualify you from courage, it was the price of it. And he'd remember that 48 was never the point. The point was that the platoon had been outnumbered and outpositioned and still found a way to move. The point was that survival sometimes came down to refusing the obvious option and choosing the one that looked insane, because insanity was better than certainty. If there's a lesson in what happened in that valley, it isn't that one man can do the impossible. It's that the stories that sound impossible are often built out of small, brutal decisions made under pressure, decisions that don't feel heroic in the moment, only necessary. In Vietnam, thousands of men made those decisions and never had their names attached to anything larger than a quiet memory in someone else's home. So if you've ever heard a story from a father, a grandfather, an uncle, neighbor, something they mentioned once and never brought up again, treat it like what it is, a piece of history that almost disappeared. Those stories are how the people who didn't make it home stay remembered, and how the ones who did make it home are finally understood.